This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. The air in the Lisbon reception hall tasted of stale lilies and expensive hypocrisy. I stood by the arched window, my fingers tracing the cold condensation on a glass of sparkling water, watching my mother-in-law Beatriz command the room like a grieving queen who had already picked her next victim. This wasn't just a funeral for a distant uncle. It was a theater of power, a carefully choreographed display of family unity, designed to remind me exactly where I stood, which was nowhere. My husband, Leo, was across the room, his shoulders slumped in that familiar, submissive curve he adopted whenever his parents were within breathing distance. He wouldn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me since we arrived. He knew what was coming, or at least he knew the flavor of the ambush, even if he didn't know the ingredients. For months, the whispers had been growing louder, the subtle hints about legacy and traditional upbringing turning into a dull, constant roar. They didn't see a biotech researcher with a career and a mind of her own. They saw a vessel for the Carter name and a temporary guardian for my son, Toby. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the hidden camera's remote in my clutch bag, a silent witness to the months of advice that had bordered on psychological warfare. Beatriz leaned in close to a family friend, her voice carrying just enough to reach my ears, honeyed and lethal, speaking about how some people just didn't understand the sanctity of the ancestral soil. She was setting the stage, painting me as the outsider, the cold professional who lacked the heart to raise a child in the shadow of their history. What she didn't realize was that I had spent my nights not crying, but digging through public records and tax filings that she thought were buried as deep as the man we were honoring today. The ancestral land they boasted about wasn't a gift. It was a ticking financial time bomb, and they were planning to use my son as the ultimate collateral to save their own crumbling status. The room was full of people who thrived on this kind of social theater, cousins waiting for a slip-up, aunts ready to tut-tut at any sign of disrespect. I could feel the trap closing, the familiar pressure of age hierarchy and social peace being used as a silencer. But as Beatriz tapped her glass to signal the start of the dinner, a sharp, cold clarity washed over me. They wanted a public performance. I would give them one they would never forget. I wasn't the quiet girl they married off to their son anymore. I was a woman who had documented every expense, every threatening message, and every lie they'd told to keep Leo under their thumb. The dinner was about to serve more than just cod and wine. It was about to serve the truth about the Carter legacy. As we moved toward the long, candlelit table, Leo finally caught my eye, his gaze pleading for me to just keep the peace for one more night. He had no idea that the peace had already been broken, shattered by the very people he was trying to protect. I felt the vibration of my phone in my bag, a message from the nanny cam back at our apartment, a notification that someone had entered our private space while we were away. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with the grim satisfaction of a trap finally being sprung. They thought they were the ones in control, the ones who decided the future of my family, but they were standing on a foundation of quicksand and unpaid liens. The silence that fell over the table as Beatriz stood up to speak was heavy, expectant, and suffocating. She looked directly at me, a thin, triumphant smile playing on her lips, and cleared her throat. "Family is the soil in which we grow," she began, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, "and it is time we ensure our youngest branch grows where he belongs." My grip tightened on my glass. This was it. The moment they declared their intentions to the world, thinking the public setting would force my hand. Little did they know, the audience they had gathered wasn't there to witness my submission. They were there to witness the end of an empire built on secrets. Beatriz's voice projected to the back of the vaulted dining hall, carrying that practiced tremor of a matriarch who had spent decades perfecting the art of the emotional guilt trip. She spoke of legacy, of the sprawling estate in the Alentejo region that had been in the Carter name for generations, and of the sacred duty to ensure Toby grew up breathing the air of his ancestors rather than the sterile wind of a city apartment. The guests nodded, their faces softened by wine and the romanticized notion of family roots. Beside me, Leo stared intensely at his gold-rimmed plate, his knuckles white as he gripped his linen napkin. He didn't defend our life in Lisbon. He didn't mention our careers or the home we had built with our own sweat and late-night shifts. He sat there like a statue of a son, carved by his mother's expectations, while Beatriz reached the crescendo of her announcement that Toby would be moving to the estate by the end of the month to begin his true education under the guidance of the family elders. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a proclamation of ownership. I felt the collective gaze of 40 relatives shift toward me, a wall of expectant silence demanding my gratitude, or at the very least, my silent acquiescence. Beatrice's eyes locked onto mine, glinting with the triumph of a woman who thought she had used the weight of a funeral to bury my autonomy. She expected me to crumble under the social pressure, to avoid a scene in front of the grieving family. But as I looked around the table, I saw more than just judgmental relatives. I saw the very people Beatriz had been lying to for years. I saw the cousins who had invested their own small inheritances into the family trust, and the aunts who believed the estate was a fortress of financial stability. I set my glass down. The sharp clink against the mahogany table was like a starter pistol. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. Instead, I leaned back, a small, cold smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, a look that clearly unsettled Beatriz because her triumphant mask flickered for a fraction of a second. I thought about the digital folder on my phone, synced to the cloud, containing the title search results I'd run 3 weeks ago. The Alentejo estate wasn't a sanctuary. It was a legal nightmare of unpaid property taxes and secondary liens that Beatriz had kept hidden even from her own husband. They weren't trying to raise Toby on family land. They were trying to move into a primary residence that they could legally claim as a family homestead to shield it from creditors, using my son as the human shield for their bankruptcy. Leo finally reached under the table, his hand finding mine, but not to support me. He squeezed my fingers in a silent command to stay quiet, to let the moment pass, to deal with it later in the privacy of a home that was becoming less of a home every day. His cowardice was the final ingredient in my resolve. Across the table, his younger sister, Sophia, the golden child who had always been Beatriz's favorite accomplice, smirked at me, her eyes mocking my supposed helplessness. She was the one who had been helping me with Toby, which really meant she had been the one installing the hidden pressures and reporting my every move back to the matriarch. What Sophia didn't know was that the nanny cam I'd set up wasn't just in Toby's nursery. It was in the home office where she thought she was having private phone calls about the family's mounting debts. "It's a beautiful vision, Beatriz," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs like a scalpel. The table went deathly still. Leo's grip on my hand tightened to the point of pain, but I didn't flinch. The idea of Toby growing up on land that means so much to this family. It's almost poetic. I paused, letting the irony hang in the air just long enough for Beatriz's eyes to narrow in suspicion. But I'm curious. When you say he'll be raised there, are you planning to include the tax collectors in his daily lessons? Or will the bank be providing the tutors once the foreclosure is finalized next quarter? The color drained from Beatriz's face so fast it was as if I'd physically struck her. A low, confused murmur broke out among the relatives. My father-in-law, who had been stoic and silent until now, sat bolt upright, his gaze darting between his wife and me. The peace they had worked so hard to curate was disintegrating in real time. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, opening the first document, a certified notice of default on the very land they were currently gifting to my son. I felt the shift in the room, the sudden violent pivot from a celebration of legacy to a scramble for survival, as the family myth began to fracture right before their eyes. The silence that followed was visceral, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears like a physical blow. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock at the far end of the hall, each second sounding like a nail being driven into the coffin of the Carter family reputation. Beatrice didn't move. She looked like a gargoyle carved from ice, her mouth slightly parted as she struggled to find the breath to refute me. The relatives, those vultures of social standing, were already leaning in, their eyes darting between us, hungry for the first sign of a carcass. My father-in-law, Arthur, finally found his voice, though it was thin and raspy, stripped of its usual patriarchal authority. He demanded to know what I was talking about, his hand trembling as he reached for the wine bottle. I didn't blink. I slid my phone across the polished wood toward him, the screen glowing with a PDF of the lien notice I'd spent 3 weeks verifying. "It's all there, Arthur," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the shaking anger they expected. "The Alentejo estate has over 200,000 euros in unpaid taxes and secondary loans. Loans taken out by a shell company Beatrice registered in Sophia's name last spring." A collective gasp rippled through the table. Sophia, who had been smirking just moments ago, suddenly looked like she wanted to vanish into the upholstery of her chair. Her eyes went wide, darting to her mother for a script that hadn't been written for this ending. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was systemic. They had been gaslighting me for years about my obsession with work and my lack of family values, all while they were systematically dismantling the very legacy they used to bash me over the head. Leo finally let go of my hand, but not to support me. He pulled back as if I were radioactive. "Emily, stop this," he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper. "Not here. Not now." He was still choosing the ghost of his mother's approval over the reality of our survival. He was willing to let his son be used as a legal pawn just to avoid a scene at a dinner party. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just fighting his parents. I was fighting the shadow of the man I thought I married. Beatrice finally found her footing, her eyes flashing with a desperate, cornered kind of rage. She laughed, a brittle, hollow sound that fooled no one. "This is what happens when you let a scientist into a family of tradition," she sneered, looking around at the guests for backup. "They see numbers where there is only love. They see cold facts where there is heritage. These are temporary, administrative hurdles, nothing more." She turned back to me, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "How dare you bring your workplace paranoia into this house? You have no right to question our stewardship of what was here long before you arrived." But the seed of doubt had already sprouted. One of the elder cousins, a man who had put a significant portion of his retirement into the family heritage fund, cleared his throat. "Wait a minute, Beatrice. Sophia's name? On a loan?" He reached for the phone, his face hardening as he scrolled through the documents I'd meticulously organized. The theater of mourning was officially over. The audit had begun. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. This was the first major climax I had prepared for, but I knew Beatrice had one more card to play. She stood up, her stature suddenly imposing despite her age, and pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you're so clever with your records and your digital toys," she spat, her voice rising to a screech that shattered the last remnants of her dignified facade. "But you're still the woman who leaves her child with a nanny while she plays in a lab. You're the mother who isn't there." She looked at the room, her eyes wild. "And I have the footage to prove who the real danger is." She reached into her own silk clutch, and for a second, my heart skipped a beat. She thought she had her own gotcha moment. She thought she was the only one with a camera. Beatrice's hand didn't tremble as she pulled a small silver thumb drive from her bag, holding it up like a holy relic. The room, which had been buzzing with the scandal of the tax liens, fell into a different kind of silence, a heavy, voyeuristic hush. This was the weapon she had been saving, the nuclear option she intended to use to justify seizing custody of Toby. "You talk of money, Emily," she said, her voice regaining its chilling composure. "But money is paper. Character is soul, and I have seen the soul of your household when you aren't there to perform." She looked at Leo, her eyes softening into a manipulative mask of pity. "My poor son, you had no idea who you were sharing a bed with." She gestured to the large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the dining hall, usually reserved for memorial slideshows of the deceased. A tech-savvy cousin, sensing the shift in power, scurried over to plug the drive in. I felt Leo's body pull even further away from mine, his breathing shallow and jagged. He was terrified of what was about to appear on that screen, and for a split second, so was I. Not because I had anything to hide, but because I knew how easily Beatrice could twist a moment out of context to make a mother look like a monster. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy, wide-angle view of our living room in Lisbon. The footage was from 3 days ago. It showed me standing in the kitchen, exhausted, my hair disheveled, snapping at Toby to just sit still for 1 second, while I tried to handle a crisis on my work laptop. Then it showed me walking out of the room, leaving him crying in his high chair for several minutes while I paced the hallway, rubbing my temples. To a room full of traditionalists, this was the ultimate sin. A mother prioritizing her career over the immediate emotional comfort of her child. Beatrice let the clip play in a loop, the sound of Toby's muffled cries echoing through the expensive speakers. "Neglect," she whispered loudly enough for the entire table to hear. "Emotional abandonment. Is this the modern parenting we are supposed to respect?" But as the clip continued, something changed. I saw the date and timestamp in the corner of the video. It wasn't just my living room. It was the footage from the camera she had illegally installed in my smoke detector. My heart hammered, but not with shame, with the realization that she had just walked straight into the very trap I had laid. She was so blinded by her desire to shame me that she hadn't watched the full file, or perhaps she hadn't realized that my own security system had been recording her recording me. "Is that all, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet it carried over the sound of the TV. I stood up, slowly, smoothed my black dress, and looked around at the faces of the family. Some looked disgusted, others horrified, but all were staring at the screen. Because if we're playing home movies, I think you missed the best part. I pulled a small remote from my pocket, the one paired to the nanny cam I had hidden inside a stuffed animal in Toby's room, the one she didn't know about. I pointed it at the TV, bypassing her drive with a wireless override I'd spent the previous night coding. The screen went black for a second, then blinked into a new perspective. It was the interior of my home office. The date was the same. The footage showed Sophia and Beatrice entering the room while I was at the lab. They weren't looking for Toby. They were opening my filing cabinets, tossing my private research notes onto the floor, and laughing as they tore up the legal documents I had prepared for our move. But then the audio kicked in. Clear, crisp, and undeniable. "We'll just tell the court she hit him," Sophia's voice rang out, casual as if she were discussing the weather. "If we bruise his arm a little before the social worker arrives, Emily will never see him again. Then the estate stays in the family name through the trust we set up for the boy." The room didn't just go silent, it turned into a vacuum. The air seemed to vanish. Arthur dropped his wine glass, and the red liquid splattered across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. I turned to look at my sister-in-law, whose face had gone from triumphant to a sickly, mottled gray. The golden child was caught on camera planning to physically harm my son to secure a bankrupt estate. This wasn't just a family feud anymore. It was a criminal conspiracy, and I had 40 witnesses with front row seats. The audio from the television screen hissed with the cold, calculated malice of Beatrice and Sophia's voices, repeating the plan to bruise Toby's arm. The sound seemed to vibrate the very foundation of the hall. For a heartbeat, the only movement was the flickering light of the screen reflecting off the polished silverware. Then the explosion happened. Not of noise, but of movement. Arthur, his face a terrifying shade of purple, lurched toward the screen as if he could physically grab the words and shove them back into the speakers. Sophia let out a choked, animalistic sound and collapsed into her chair, her hands over her mouth, while Beatrice, the woman who had commanded this family with an iron whim for 40 years, remained perfectly still, though her eyes were darting around the room like a trapped predator looking for an exit that no longer existed. "You were going to hurt him?" Leo's voice was barely a croak. He had finally stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. He looked at his mother as if seeing a monster for the first time. The man who had spent his life apologizing for his existence was suddenly vibrating with a primal, protective rage. He didn't look at me for permission or guidance. He turned toward Beatrice, his shadow looming large over the table. "You were going to touch my son to save a piece of dirt in Alentejo?" Beatrice didn't apologize. She didn't weep. She straightened her spine, her pearls catching the light, and looked at her son with chilling disdain. "I was going to save this family," she shrieked, the mask finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You are weak, Leo. You married a woman who counts pennies and cares more for her data than her name. That land is who we are. If I had to ensure the boy stayed with us by any means necessary, I would do it again." The admission was the final nail. The room erupted into chaos. The elder cousins were shouting about their stolen investments, and the aunts were recoiling in horror from Sophia. I stood in the center of the storm, the calmest person in the room. I wasn't just a researcher anymore. I was the architect of their downfall. I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of manila folders I had hidden under my seat earlier that evening. "The police have the full footage, Beatrice," I said, my voice cold and surgical. "And the tax authorities have the records of the shell company. But these..." I tossed the folders onto the table, where they slid through the spilled wine. "These are the civil suits. Every person at this table that you defrauded to pay for your lifestyle is listed as a witness." The realization hit the room like a second wave. I wasn't just defending my son, I was dismantling the entire Carter financial structure. The relatives, seeing the evidence of their own lost money, turned on Beatrice and Arthur with a ferocity that was almost hard to watch. The family unity they had weaponized against me for a decade had turned into a piranha tank, and Beatrice was the only thing bleeding. Amidst the screaming, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Leo. His eyes were red, his face a mask of shame and grief. "Emily, I didn't know," he whispered, his voice trembling. He looked at the folders, then at the screen, then back at me, searching for the wife who used to look at him with nothing but love. But that Emily was gone, buried under years of his silence. I looked at his hand on my arm and then looked him directly in the eyes. I didn't feel anger toward him anymore, just a profound, hollow pity. "That's the problem, Leo," I said, pulling my arm away. "You never wanted to know." I turned to walk toward the exit, the sound of the family tearing itself apart echoing behind me. But as I reached the heavy oak doors, a sharp, metallic sound stopped me in my tracks. It was the sound of the front door being bolted from the outside. Arthur was standing by the control panel, his eyes wild and desperate, holding a heavy set of keys. He wasn't going to let the evidence, or me, leave this hall. Arthur's chest heaved as he stood by the heavy oak doors, the metallic thud of the deadbolt echoing like a gavel. The man who had spent 40 years maintaining a facade of aristocratic dignity now looked like a cornered animal, his face a terrifying mask of sweat and desperation. "Nobody leaves," he roared, his voice cracking with a frantic, dangerous edge. "We are a family. We settled this as a family. You think you can just walk in here, destroy our name, and walk out to the authorities. The room surged with a new, sharper kind of fear. The cousins who had been shouting for their money suddenly fell silent, looking at the patriarch who had finally snapped. I stood my ground in the center of the hall, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I refused to let him see the tremor in my hands. I looked at the heavy brass keys clutched in his trembling fist. This was the second climax I had anticipated, though I hadn't expected Arthur to be the one to physically block the exit. He was the silent partner, the one who let Beatriz do the dirty work while he enjoyed the status. But now that the status was gone, the foundation had crumbled. "Arthur, move away from the door," I said, my voice dropping into a low, steady register. The footage didn't just go to a cloud, it was a live stream. My colleagues at the lab, people who handle high-security data for a living, are watching this in real time. If I don't check in within the next 5 minutes, the Lisbon police will be at these gates. It was a bluff, partly. The stream was recording, but the police response wasn't that automated yet. But in his state of mind, the technical jargon sounded like an inescapable net. Leo stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and a sudden, burgeoning courage. "Dad, give her the keys. It's over. Can't you see that? Sophia, tell him." But Sophia was a hollow shell, staring at the screen where her own voice continued to plot the assault of a toddler. She was catatonic, her golden child armor shattered into dust. Beatriz, however, wasn't done. She moved toward Arthur, her eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "Don't you dare, Arthur. If she leaves with that phone, we lose everything. The house, the land, the name, everything goes to the creditors." She turned her gaze on me, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of her pathology. She didn't care about Toby. She didn't even care about Leo. She cared about the illusion of the Carter dynasty. "You think you've won because you have facts?" she hissed, stepping closer, her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. "In this country, in this city, we are the Carters. You are a girl from a provincial town with a degree and a chip on her shoulder. We can make you disappear from every professional circle in Portugal. We can make sure you never work in biotech again." I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that seemed to slice through her threats. "Beatriz, look around you." I gestured to the relatives who were now backing away from her as if she were a leper. "You aren't the Carters anymore. You're the people who tried to frame a mother and steal from their own blood. Your circles are already closing their doors. I've already sent the files to the board of the Heritage Fund. By tomorrow morning, you'll be removed from every committee you pride yourself on." The realization finally hit her. The social death she feared more than actual death was already happening. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of the mahogany table, her hand landing in the puddle of spilled wine. At that moment, a loud, insistent pounding began on the other side of the oak doors. Not the police. Not yet. It was the staff, the people they had treated like furniture for years, demanding to know what was happening. Arthur looked at the door, then at his wife, then at the keys. The weight of the world he had built on lies was too heavy to hold up any longer. His hand went limp, and the keys clattered to the floor. I didn't wait. I stepped forward, picked them up, and looked at Leo. He reached out to me, his eyes pleading for forgiveness I didn't have the energy to give. "I'm going to get my son," I said, my voice as cold as the Atlantic. "And Leo, don't bother coming back to the apartment." I changed the codes an hour before the funeral started. I turned the key, the bolt sliding back with a definitive bone-deep click. As the doors swung open, the cool night air of Lisbon rushed in, smelling of salt and freedom. The cool night air didn't just feel like a breeze, it felt like an exorcism. I stepped out onto the gravel driveway of the estate, my heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the stones, the sound of a woman walking away from a wreckage she hadn't started, but had certainly finished. Behind me, the muffled sounds of the Carter family's collapse continued to spill out of the open doors. I could hear Arthur's broken shouting and the shrill, desperate tones of Beatrice trying to negotiate with a room that no longer feared her. I didn't look back. I reached my car, my hands finally starting to shake as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving a hollow, aching cold in its wake. I fumbled with my phone, dialing the one person I knew I could trust, my lawyer, Marcos. He picked up on the second ring. "It's done," I whispered, my voice cracking for the first time that night. "I have the footage, the witnesses, and the confession. Get the emergency injunction ready. I'm going to the apartment to get Toby, and then we're heading to the safe house." "Emily, slow down." Marcos's voice was a grounding wire. "Is Leo with you?" "Leo is exactly where he belongs," I said, looking at the rearview mirror as I started the engine. In the reflection, I saw the silhouette of my husband standing in the doorway of the hall, framed by the light of the disaster. He looked small, diminished. He wasn't following me. He was still standing in the shadow of his parents' house, paralyzed by the weight of a choice he was 20 years too late to make. He's with his family, Marcos. I'm going to mine. As I drove through the winding streets of Lisbon, the city lights blurred into long, golden streaks. My mind was racing ahead, calculating the next moves. The tax liens were the leverage I needed to ensure they could never touch my assets, but the video of Sofia and Beatriz was the shield that would keep Toby safe forever. In Portugal, the law took family rights seriously, but it took child endangerment and conspiracy even more so. I had spent years analyzing data, finding patterns in cellular structures and predicting outcomes. I had applied that same clinical precision to my own life, and the result was a clean break. I reached our apartment building in record time. The lobby was quiet, the doorman offering a polite nod that felt surreal given the war I had just walked out of. I took the elevator up to the penthouse, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. When the doors opened, I sprinted to our unit. I punched in the new code, the date of my first successful research grant, a date that belonged only to me, and heard the lock cycle. The apartment was dim, save for the soft glow of the nightlight in the hallway. I moved toward Toby's room, my breath hitching in my throat. I pushed the door open, expecting to see my son sleeping peacefully, but the sight that greeted me made my blood turn to ice. The crib was empty. The stuffed animal that housed my hidden camera was lying face down on the floor, its seams ripped open. My phone buzzed in my hand. A restricted number. I slid the bar to answer, my voice a strangled gasp. "Where is he?" "You were always so proud of your data, Emily." Beatrice's voice came through the line, calm, low, and terrifyingly triumphant. She wasn't at the hall anymore. "But you forgot that I have my own keys to your life. Did you really think I'd let you walk away with the only thing that matters?" A floorboard creaked in the living room behind me. I turned, the phone still pressed to my ear, and saw the shadow of someone standing in the dark, holding a familiar silhouetted bundle. The silhouette in the living room shifted, stepping into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My heart stopped, then restarted with a violent, painful thud. It was Sofia. She was holding Toby, who was bundled in his favorite blue blanket, his small head resting against her shoulder. He was unnaturally still, his breathing deep and heavy, too heavy for a normal nap. My eyes darted to the emptied bottle of pediatric sedative on the coffee table. "You drugged him?" I whispered, the words tasting like ash. My phone was still pressed to my ear, Beatrice's breathing a rhythmic, ghostly presence on the other side of the line. "It's just a mild dose, Emily. Don't be so dramatic," Sofia said. Her voice was no longer the shaky, broken thing it had been at the dinner table. It was cold, focused, and laced with a terrifying clarity. She had fled the reception hall through the service entrance the moment the chaos started, while I was busy making my grand exit. "Mother was right. You're all about the optics. You wanted to win the room, but you forgot to win the war." "Sofia, give him to me," I said, taking a cautious step forward, my hands out as if approaching a wounded animal. The police are already looking for you. You were on camera. You're adding kidnapping to a list of felonies that will keep you in a cell for a decade." "A cell?" Sophia laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound that made Toby stir in his sleep. "The Carters don't go to cells, Emily. We go to the estate. And by the time your data reaches a judge who isn't on our Christmas card list, Toby will be across the border. We have a private airstrip on the Alentejo land. Did you think the tax liens meant the plane stopped flying?" On the phone, Beatrice finally spoke again, her voice a silk ribbon of malice. "The footage you have is a deepfake, Emily. That's what our lawyers will say. A disgruntled, unstable wife with a background in digital biotech? You're the perfect suspect for tampering with evidence. But if you hand over the original files now, Sophia will put the boy down and walk away. You can have your son, and we'll have our silence. It was the ultimate trade, my evidence for my child. They were betting that my maternal instinct would override my thirst for justice. They expected me to crumble, to delete the files, and to spend the rest of my life in fear of the next time they decided to take him. But they didn't know how a scientist handles a hostage situation. I wasn't just looking at Sophia. I was looking at the reflection in the window behind her. The reflection of the hallway where I had installed the high-decibel security alarm specifically for intruders. "I can't delete what's already integrated into the server, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a low, clinical hum. I reached into my pocket, my fingers finding the secondary remote. "And Sophia, you're right. I am all about the optics, like the optic sensors in this room that just detected an unauthorized chemical substance in my son's system." I didn't wait for her to respond. I pressed the button. The apartment didn't just erupt in sound. It erupted in light. Strobe pulses designed to disorient, and a siren so loud it felt like a physical weight. Sophia shrieked, dropping to her knees as she tried to cover her ears. Toby sliding from her lap onto the thick shag rug. I lunged. I wasn't a researcher anymore. I was a mother reclaiming her world. I scooped Toby into my arms, the weight of his limp body fueling a surge of rage I didn't know I possessed. I kicked the phone out of Sophia's reach and backed toward the heavy steel door of the nursery, which was reinforced for exactly this kind of nightmare. As I slammed the nursery door and engaged the deadbolt, I heard Sophia pounding on the wood, her screams lost in the roar of the alarm. I slumped against the door, clutching Toby to my chest, checking his pulse with trembling fingers. It was steady, strong. I looked up at the nursery's internal camera, the one that was hardwired, not wireless, and saw the first blue, and red lights reflecting off the buildings across the street. But then the alarm cut out. Not because the police had arrived, but because the power to the entire floor had been severed. In the sudden, suffocating silence, I heard the sound of a key turning in the nursery door. A key that only 2 people in the world possessed. "Emily?" Leo's voice came from the other side of the door, trembling and thick with tears. "Emily, open up. I have to fix this." I pulled Toby tighter against my chest, his small, limp body a heavy reminder of the betrayal pulsing through the walls of this apartment. The silence following the cut power was absolute, broken only by the frantic scratching of Leo's key against the deadbolt. My heart felt like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. I had spent years thinking Leo was just a victim of his mother's shadow, but as the lock groaned under his pressure, I realized he was the shadow itself, the one that allowed the darkness to hide. "Emily, please," Leo's voice cracked, muffled by the reinforced wood. "I'm trying to save us. If the police come, there's no going back. Sophia's panicked. She's not thinking straight. If I can just get you and Toby to the car, we can handle this privately. We can settle the debts, we can get Sophia help. But if you let those sirens get closer, you're destroying everything I've worked for." "Everything you worked for?" I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. I looked at Toby's pale face in the moonlight. Leo hadn't worked for anything. He had simply been a placeholder for a dynasty that was already a ghost. He wasn't trying to save his son. He was trying to save his inheritance, his comfort, and the delusion that his family were the good people of Lisbon. Behind him, I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of Sophia's heels on the hardwood. "Leo, hurry up. I can hear the sirens. If she doesn't give us the phone, we're done." Her voice was shrill, teetering on the edge of a total breakdown. The golden child was realizing that her mother's protection didn't extend to the back of a police cruiser. I crawled toward the window, keeping low, my eyes scanning the street below. The blue and red lights were turning the corner, reflecting off the glass of the neighboring luxury towers. They were seconds away. But seconds were an eternity when the person you once loved was trying to break down the door to hide the truth. "Emily, I'm not going to ask again." Leo's voice hardened, a flash of his father's cold authority bleeding through. The door shuddered as he threw his weight against it. He didn't know I had reinforced the frame months ago when I first started feeling like a prisoner in my own marriage. "You're being irrational. You're the one who started this at the dinner. You provoked them." The gaslighting was the final straw. It was the same rhythm they had played for years. Emily is too sensitive. Emily is too focused on work. Emily is the reason the family is stressed. I reached for the tablet I had hidden under Toby's crib, a secondary control for the building's internal comm system. It was still powered by the emergency backup battery. "Leo," I said, my voice projected through the apartment's built-in speakers, sounding like a goddess of judgment echoing through the dark rooms. "The police aren't just coming for Sophia. They're coming for the person who cut the power to a residential building to facilitate a kidnapping. Look at the camera in the hallway, Leo. Look at what you've become." On the small tablet screen, I saw him freeze. He looked up at the tiny black dome of the hallway camera. For a moment, our eyes met through the lens. He looked terrified, a little boy caught with his hand in the drawer, but the greed was still there. Sophia was behind him, clutching a heavy decorative vase, ready to strike if the door gave way. Then, the heavy front door of the apartment was kicked open. "Policia! Largia arma!" The shouting from the hallway was a symphony of justice. I heard the vase shatter on the floor. I heard Sophia's scream turn into a sob, and I heard the heavy, dull thud of Leo being tackled to the ground. I didn't move. I stayed on the floor, shielding Toby until the frantic pounding on the nursery door was replaced by the calm, professional voice of an officer. "Sonora Carter, it's the police. You're safe." I didn't open the door immediately. I waited until I heard the sound of handcuffs clicking, 3 times. One for Sophia, one for Leo. And the third? The third was for Beatrice, who I could hear on the speaker, still screaming through the phone Sophia had dropped, claiming her rights, her name, and her land. I turned the bolt. The door swung open, and the bright flashlights of the tactical team blinded me. As I handed Toby to the waiting paramedics, I saw Leo being led out in shadows. He looked at me, his face wet with tears, pleading for one last lie. I didn't give it to him. I looked at the officer and pointed to the hidden drive still clutched in Leo's hand, the one he had tried to take from me. "That's the evidence of the conspiracy," I said, my voice echoing in the hollow apartment. "But the real crime is in the Alentejo estate, and I think you'll find my mother-in-law is already waiting for you there." The paramedics began to wheel Toby out, and I followed, not once looking back at the man I had married. But as we reached the elevator, the lead detective stopped me, his face grim. "Sonora, we found something else in your husband's car. Something you need to see." The lead detective, a man with eyes that had seen too many family tragedies in the shadows of Lisbon's elite, led me toward the underground garage. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and the heavy, humid heat of a Portuguese night. Toby was already in the ambulance, a paramedic assuring me that the sedative was wearing off and he was stable. I should have been with him, but the urgency in the detective's stride told me that the nightmare wasn't quite over. We reached Leo's silver sedan, which sat awkwardly across 2 parking spaces. The trunk was popped open. Inside wasn't just luggage or the usual debris of a life being lived. It was a stack of professional-grade surveillance equipment, similar to what I used in the lab, but modified for a much darker purpose. However, that wasn't what the detective wanted me to see. He pointed to a small, unassuming leather satchel tucked into the spare tire well. Inside were 3 forged passports, one for Leo, one for Toby, and one for a woman whose photo made my breath hitch. It wasn't Sophia. It wasn't Beatrice. It was a woman I had seen in our building's lobby a dozen times. A woman Leo had introduced as a new neighbor months ago. He wasn't just helping his mother, Senora, the detective said, his voice a low rumble of pity. He was planning his own exit. It seems your husband was using the family's financial collapse as a smokescreen to disappear with your son and your research patents. The land in Alentejo was never the destination. It was just the distraction. The betrayal hit me with the force of a physical blow. I leaned against the cold concrete pillar of the garage, the world spinning. Leo hadn't just been a coward or a victim of his mother's manipulation. He had been the ultimate opportunist. He was going to let his mother and sister take the fall for the kidnapping, while he slipped away under a new identity, taking the biotech breakthroughs I had spent a decade developing, patents worth millions on the black market. He wasn't choosing his family, he was choosing himself, and he had been planning it for months. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice coming from a place of cold, hollow iron. The woman in the photo. "We picked her up at the airport an hour ago," the detective replied, closing the satchel. "She was waiting for him at the gate for the flight to Dubai. She's already talking. It seems your husband didn't just steal your heart, Emily. He was selling your life's work to the highest bidder to pay off his own secret gambling debts." I looked up at the ceiling, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, distorted shadows. Every memory I had of the last year, every "I love you," every "let's just keep the peace," was a calculated move in a game I didn't even know I was playing. The in-laws were a horror, yes, but they were a loud, visible horror. Leo was the silent poison in the well. As they loaded the evidence into the police van, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of liberation. The Carter family hadn't just fractured, they had disintegrated. I walked back toward the elevator, my phone buzzing with a notification. It was a remote alert from the Alentejo Estate's security system, which I had hacked into weeks ago. The footage showed Beatrice being led out of her ancestral home in handcuffs, her silk gown trailing in the dirt she loved more than her own children. She looked small, old, and utterly defeated. But as she reached the police car, she turned and looked directly into the camera lens, as if she knew I was watching. She mouthed 3 words that chilled me to the bone. "It isn't over." I hit the delete button on the app, erasing the connection to that house forever. I didn't care about her threats or Leo's lies anymore. I had my son, and I had the truth. But as I stepped into the ambulance to join Toby, I noticed a small, blinking light on his blue blanket. A device I hadn't put there. My fingers brushed against the small hard object pinned to the underside of Toby's blanket. It was a GPS tracker, no larger than a coin, its red light blinking like a mocking heartbeat. I felt a fresh wave of nausea. This wasn't just a backup plan. It was a contingency for a contingency. The sophistication of the tech suggested it didn't come from Beatrice's old-world tactics. This was a professional-grade asset, likely provided by whoever Leo was planning to sell my research to. "Is everything okay, Senora?" the paramedic asked, noticing my sudden stillness. "Yes," I lied, slipping the tracker into the pocket of my coat, shielding the light with my palm. Just a bit overwhelmed. I sat beside Toby, watching his chest rise and fall. He was safe for the moment, but the world around us was now a landscape of hidden threats. If I handed this tracker to the police now, it would become evidence in a trial that could take years. But if I kept it, I had something better. A lead on the people who had truly bought my husband's soul. As the ambulance sped through the cobblestone streets of Lisbon, the sirens wailing against the quiet night, I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Marcos. I opened an encrypted messaging app and typed a single phrase to a contact I hadn't spoken to since my university days, a man who lived in the gray areas of corporate intelligence. The package was compromised. I need to know who was at the other end of the Dubai flight. The reply came back in seconds. You're playing with fire, Emily. Those aren't just investors. They're a private equity firm that specializes in hostile acquisitions of intellectual property. If Leo failed them, they won't just walk away. I looked at the tracker in my hand. Leo hadn't just been running away from his family. He had been running toward a cage of his own making, and he had tried to drag our son into it. The realization that the in-laws were actually the lesser of the two evils was a bitter pill to swallow. Beatrice and Sophia were motivated by pride and greed. The people Leo was dealing with were motivated by pure, calculated profit. To them, my son was just a piece of leverage to ensure my cooperation in the future. We arrived at the hospital under a heavy police escort. The ER was a blur of white light and sterile smells. They took Toby for observation, and I was ushered into a private waiting room. 2 officers stationed at the door. I sat on the vinyl chair, the silence of the room pressing in on me. I thought about the dinner at the estate, how long ago that felt. The family land, the tax liens, the nanny cam footage. It all felt like child's play now. I had been playing a game of checkers against Beatrice, while Leo had been playing a game of high-stakes poker with my life. A knock at the door startled me. It was the detective from the garage. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his face etched with the grim reality of the night's paperwork. "The woman at the airport is cooperating," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "She's confirmed that Leo had been in contact with a group out of Geneva. But there's a problem, Emily." My heart skipped. "What problem?" "The passports," he said, his voice dropping. "We ran the numbers. They aren't just forgeries. They were issued by a government office with high-level clearance. Whoever is backing your husband has deep roots in the ministry. This isn't just a domestic dispute anymore. It's an international investigation, and the higher-ups are already trying to pull the file from my desk." He walked over and handed me a small, transparent evidence bag. Inside was a SIM card. "We found this hidden in Leo's shoe during the booking. He was trying to swallow it. We haven't cracked the encryption yet, but there's a name that keeps popping up in the metadata." I looked at the bag, then back at the detective. "Whose name?" "Arthur Carter," he said. I froze. Arthur? The silent patriarch? The man who had stood by the door with the keys, looking like a broken shell? I had assumed he was just a bystander to Beatrice's madness, but as I remembered the way he held those keys, not with fear, but with a desperate hidden strength, a new, terrifying picture began to form. Arthur wasn't the victim of Beatrice. Beatrice was the distraction for Arthur. "He's not at the estate, Emily," the detective whispered. "He slipped out of the police cruiser during the transport. He's gone." The hospital room felt like a cold, pressurized chamber as the detective's words settled into my bones. Arthur was gone. The man I had dismissed as a hollow vessel for Beatrice's vanity was actually the architect behind the curtain. I looked down at the SIM card in the evidence bag, then at the tracker in my pocket. The family land, with its tax liens, wasn't a failure of management. It was a deliberate liquidation of assets. They weren't losing their money, they were moving it, laundering the Carter legacy into something untraceable and digital. "How does a man in his 70s vanish from a locked police cruiser?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital's HVAC system. The detective didn't look me in the eye. He stared at the linoleum floor, his jaw tight. "The officers involved claimed the door malfunctioned during a stop at a red light. By the time they cleared the intersection and pulled over, the back seat was empty. No struggle, no sound. It was a professional extraction, Emily. Someone wanted Arthur out, and they had the clearance to make it happen. I stood up, the vinyl of the chair groaning under me. The betrayal now felt like a physical weight, a literal crushing of my chest. My husband was a traitor, my mother-in-law was a sociopath, and my father-in-law was apparently a high-level asset for a shadow organization. I was a biotech researcher who had spent her life studying the predictable patterns of cells, and yet I had failed to see the cancer growing in my own living room. I walked to the window of the waiting room. Below, the hospital parking lot was a sea of gray and black cars. Somewhere out there, Arthur was regrouping. Somewhere out there, Leo's investors were realizing their primary contact was in a jail cell. I realized then that the police couldn't protect me, not if the ministry itself was compromised. The security I thought I had achieved by calling the authorities was an illusion. I was still in the hall, and the doors were still locked. I pulled the coin-sized tracker from my pocket and looked at it. If Arthur was the one who had arranged the passports and the Geneva connection, he was the one who knew exactly where this tracker was leading. I looked at the detective, a sudden, sharp idea forming in my mind. "I need to see Sophia," I said. "She's the only one who doesn't know the full plan. She was the pawn, the one they used to do the dirty work while they kept their hands clean. She'll be the first one they abandon." "She's being processed at the central station," the detective said, shaking his head. "I can't take you there, Emily. It's too dangerous." "You said it yourself. The file is being pulled from your desk," I countered, stepping closer to him. "In 2 hours, you won't have the authority to even talk to her. But right now, you're the only person who can get me in that room. If Arthur is gone, he's going to clean up his loose ends, and Sophia is the loosest end he has." The detective hesitated, the conflict playing out across his weathered face. He knew I was right. If the Carter men were as deep as this suggested, Sophia was a liability they wouldn't leave for the police to interrogate. He checked his watch, then looked at the 2 officers guarding the door. 10 minutes, he whispered. "We go through the service exit. I'll tell the nurses you're staying here with the boy." We moved through the sterile hallways of the hospital like ghosts. My mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the variables of the interrogation. As we reached the detective's unmarked car, my phone buzzed again. It was another message from my university contact. The Dubai flight just took off. It wasn't empty. There was a passenger added at the last minute using a diplomatic bypass. Name, Arthur Carter. The car engine roared to life, but my heart sank. He wasn't regrouping in Lisbon. He was already gone. But then, why was the tracker in my pocket still blinking? Why was someone still monitoring my son's location if the patriarch had already escaped? As we pulled out of the hospital gates, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled out of the shadows behind us, its headlights dark. The hunt wasn't over. It had just changed players. The black SUV clung to our rear like a shadow stitched to the asphalt. Every time the detective took a sharp turn through the narrow, skeletal streets of Lisbon's Alfama district, the twin glints of its darkened windshield followed with predatory precision. The detective's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He knew we weren't just being followed, we were being ushered. "They aren't stopping us," I whispered, my hand gripping the door handle. "They're watching where we lead them." "I'm not leading them to the station," the detective grunted, suddenly swerving into a narrow alleyway that smelled of salt and rotted citrus. "If Arthur is on that plane, then the people in that car aren't his. They're the ones he left behind to clean up the mess, or the ones he owed." We skidded to a halt behind a row of industrial dumpsters. The detective killed the lights and the engine. Silence rushed into the car, heavy and suffocating. In the side mirror, I saw the black SUV glide past the mouth of the alley, its engine a low, expensive purr. It didn't stop. It kept going, disappearing into the labyrinth of the city. But the blinking red light of the tracker in my pocket didn't slow down. It pulsed faster, a rhythmic taunt that told me they didn't need to see us to know exactly where we were sitting. "Give me the tracker, Emily," the detective said, reaching out his hand. "I'll take it. I'll lead them toward the coast while you get to the station on foot. It's only 4 blocks from here." "No," I said, a cold realization dawning on me. I pulled the small device out and held it up to the dim light of a street lamp. "If Arthur is on a plane to Dubai, he doesn't need a tracker on Toby anymore. He's already won. This isn't a beacon for a kidnapping, detective. Look at the casing." I used a small pocket knife from the glove box to pry the plastic shell open. Inside wasn't just a GPS chip. There was a tiny, high-frequency microphone and a storage drive. My breath hitched. This wasn't just tracking us, it had been recording. Every word I said in the ambulance, every conversation with the detective, every secret I thought was safe, it had all been broadcasted. "They know everything," I breathed. "They know you're helping me. They know Sophia is at the central station, and they know Arthur escaped." The detective's face went pale. He realized the trap he'd walked into. By trying to help me, he had compromised himself and the entire investigation. Before he could respond, his radio crackled to life with a burst of static that sounded like a scream. "Unit 42. Do you copy? Breach at Central. Repeat, breach at Central. Multiple armed suspects in the holding area. We have officers down." The station, Sophia. I didn't wait for the detective to give an order. I shoved the tracker into a crevice behind the dumpsters and bolted from the car. I ran, my lungs burning with the cold night air, the adrenaline of a hunted animal driving my legs. I didn't care about the black SUV or the ministry's reach. If Sophia died, the last link to the truth about the family land and the Geneva investors died with her. I reached the side entrance of the station just as the first sirens began to wail from the other side of the building. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar. I slipped inside, the hallway smelling of ozone, and spent gunpowder. The lights were flickering, the emergency backup struggling to stay online. I moved toward the holding cells, my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned the corner and stopped dead. The guard at the desk was slumped over, unconscious but breathing, and there, standing in front of Sophia's cell, was someone I never expected to see again. It wasn't a mercenary or a government agent. It was Leo's favorite sibling, the quiet one who had supposedly changed sides at the funeral. He was holding a silenced pistol, his hand trembling as he pointed it at a sobbing Sophia. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the security camera in the corner, his lips moving in a silent prayer. "I had to do it, Emily," he whispered, sensing my presence before he saw me. "They have my daughters. Arthur said if Sophia talks, they'll never come home." He turned the gun toward me, his eyes filled with a hollow, suicidal grief. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a rhythmic, dying hum, casting long, jerky shadows across the blood-spattered tile. Miguel, Leo's younger brother, the one who had always sat at the end of the table, the one who had supposedly helped me find the tax liens, looked like a man already dead. The silenced pistol in his hand was an alien weight, a cold piece of machinery that didn't belong in the grip of a man who spent his weekends painting watercolors in the Algarve. "Miguel, put it down," I said, my voice dropping into the low, clinical tone I used when a lab experiment went dangerously volatile. I didn't move. I kept my hands visible, palm out. "The daughters? Arthur took them?" "He didn't take them, Emily," Miguel sobbed, the gun shaking so violently I feared it would discharge by accident. "He invited them to the estate for a sleepover while we were at the funeral. He sent me a photo 10 minutes ago. They're in the back of a van, headed for the border. He told me if Sophia says one word about the Geneva accounts, I'd never see them again. He told me I had to clean the slate." In the cell behind the bars, Sophia was curled into a ball on the concrete floor, her expensive funeral dress torn and stained. She wasn't the arrogant manipulator anymore. She was a broken child, realizing that her father viewed her as nothing more than a loose thread to be burned. "I didn't tell them anything, Miguel," she shrieked, her voice cracking. I swear, I haven't talked yet." "It doesn't matter if you have," Miguel yelled, his eyes wild. "He doesn't trust you. He doesn't trust anyone but the ledger." I took a half step forward. The ozone smell in the hallway was thickening. "Miguel, listen to me. Arthur is already on a plane to Dubai. He's abandoned all of you. Sophia, you, the girls, you're all just distractions to buy him time to reach a jurisdiction that won't extradite him. If you kill her, you aren't saving your daughters. You're just becoming a murderer for a man who has already deleted you from his life." The logic seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He wavered, the barrel of the gun dipping toward the floor. But then the radio on the unconscious guard's belt crackled. It wasn't a police dispatch. It was a high-frequency, distorted voice that filled the narrow corridor with a chilling, metallic resonance. 3 minutes, Miguel. The perimeter is closing. Do the job, or the girls stay in the van when it crosses the bridge. Miguel's face hardened. The grief was replaced by a hollow, desperate resolve. He raised the gun again, but this time he wasn't aiming at Sophia. He was aiming at the electronic lock of the cell. He fired. The silenced thud was followed by a shower of sparks as the maglock groaned and failed. The cell door swung open with a heavy, mocking creak. "Get out," Miguel whispered to Sophia. "Run. If they see you dead, they win. If you vanish, I have leverage." He turned to me, his eyes pleading. "Emily, the tracker you found, it wasn't the only one. Arthur didn't just track Toby. He tracked the research data. It's built into the metadata of the files you uploaded to your cloud tonight. Every time you open those folders, you're sending a flare to Geneva." Before I could ask him what he meant, the heavy fire doors at the end of the hallway were blown off their hinges. The shockwave knocked me back against the wall. Through the smoke, I saw silhouettes in tactical gear. Not Portuguese police, but something sleeker, faster, and far more lethal. Miguel shoved a small, encrypted drive into my hand. "The tax liens were a lie, Emily. The land is worthless because what's under it is what they're selling. Go. Get Toby and get out of Portugal." He turned toward the approaching shadows, his trembling hands suddenly steady as he began to fire back. I grabbed Sophia by the arm, dragging her toward the ventilation shaft I'd spotted earlier, the only way out that didn't lead back into the line of fire. As we scrambled into the dark, narrow duct, the sound of Miguel's final stand echoed through the metal, followed by a silence that was far more terrifying than the gunfire. We were out of the station, but we were now the only two people alive who knew the secret of the Carter land. And the hunters were no longer just family. The ventilation shaft was a horizontal coffin, smelling of old dust and cold iron. I dragged Sophia through the darkness, her frantic, ragged breathing echoing against the metal walls like a trapped bird. Every time her heels kicked the side of the duct, the hollow clang sounded like a dinner bell for the tactical team below. Behind us, the silence from the holding cells was absolute. A heavy, suffocating void where Miguel had just sacrificed himself for a father who had already traded his soul. "He's dead, isn't he?" Sophia choked out, her voice a jagged whisper. "Miguel, he didn't make it." "Keep moving," I hissed, my palms raw from the friction of the metal. "If we stop, we're next." We reached a grated outlet 3 stories above a service alley. I kicked the mesh loose, the screen tumbling into the shadows below with a faint metallic splash. I went first, dropping into a pile of discarded industrial linens, my knees buckling under the impact. Sophia followed, collapsing into the fabric, her face a mask of smudged mascara and pure, unadulterated terror. The golden child was gone. Only the wreckage remained. I didn't give her time to weep. I grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her upright. "What is under the land, Sophia? Miguel said the tax liens were a distraction. What is really in Alentejo?" Sophia looked at me, her eyes darting toward the street where the black SUV was idling, its headlights off. "It's not just land, Emily. It's a lithium deposit, one of the largest untapped veins in southern Europe. My father didn't just want to raise Toby there, he needed the family trust status to bypass the environmental regulations and the state mining auctions. He was selling the extraction rights to a Chinese Geneva conglomerate. Your biotech patents? They weren't the prize, they were the method. They needed your enzyme research to stabilize the chemical leaching process without alerting the water authorities. The pieces clicked together with a sickening clinical precision. I wasn't just a wife or a mother to them. I was a laboratory asset they had married into the family. Leo hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had been a corporate spy in my own bed, feeding my progress reports to Arthur for years. The drive, I whispered, reaching into my pocket for the small device Miguel had shoved into my hand. What's on it? The real contracts, Sophia said, her voice trembling. The ones that show the ministry officials who took the bribes. Arthur didn't escape to Dubai because he was scared of the police. He went there to sign the final transfer. Once that money hits the Geneva accounts, the people behind him will erase everyone who knows the truth, starting with us. Suddenly, the alleyway was flooded with light. 2 motorcycles roared into the entrance, their riders clad in matte black, their visors down. They didn't identify themselves. They didn't ask us to surrender. One of them raised a compact submachine gun, the barrel glinting in the moonlight. I dove behind a concrete pillar, dragging Sophia with me just as the first burst of suppressed fire chewed into the brickwork. Dust and grit rained down on us. I looked at the drive, then at the street. Toby was still at the hospital, guarded by officers who might already be on Arthur's payroll. I was trapped in a crossfire between a dying dynasty and a global shadow, with nothing but a encrypted drive and the sister-in-law who had tried to ruin me. Sophia, listen to me, I said, my voice cold and hard as the concrete against my back. You wanted to be a Carter? This is what it costs. You're going to run toward the main road and scream for the first patrol car you see. I'm going the other way. They'll kill you, she cried. No, I said, a dark, dangerous smile touching my lips. They want the data, and I'm about to give them exactly what they asked for, with a little biotech surprise of my own. I stood up, holding the drive high in the air, the silver casing catching the glare of the motorcycle headlights. The riders froze, their weapons leveled. I didn't run. I stepped into the light. This was the first major climax of the second act, the moment the researchers stopped being the subject and started being the experimenter. The motorcycle engine snarled, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth. The 2 riders didn't move. They sat like statues of carbon fiber and malice, their visors reflecting the wreckage of the alleyway. They wanted the drive. They wanted the digital keys to a lithium empire and the chemical secrets that would make them billions. But they had spent so much time studying my patents that they had forgotten the most basic rule of my lab: never touch a sample without knowing the delivery system. You want the Carter legacy? I shouted, my voice bouncing off the damp brick walls. I held the drive between my thumb and forefinger. It's all here. Every bribe, every coordinate, every secret Arthur buried in that dirt. But the moment this casing is cracked by an unauthorized terminal, the metadata triggers a localized wipe of the Geneva accounts. You'll have the land, but the money will vanish into a black hole of encrypted charities. It was a bluff, mostly. I had spent the last 3 minutes in the shadows of the ventilation shaft coding a logic bomb into the drive's firmware. It wouldn't wipe the accounts, but it would ping every regulatory agency in the European Union the second it was plugged in. I was no longer playing for peace or family. I was playing for total scorched earth destruction. The rider on the left leaned forward, the suppressed barrel of his weapon dipping slightly. He didn't believe me, but he couldn't afford to be wrong. Sophia was already 10 yards away, scrambling toward the mouth of the alley, her screams for help finally catching the attention of a distant patrol siren. The riders had a choice: finish the witness or secure the asset. Take it! I yelled, and with a sudden, violent heave, I flung the silver drive into the air. It arched through the moonlight, a glittering streak of metal. Both riders reacted instinctively, their eyes following the trajectory. As the drive tumbled toward a stack of wooden pallets, the rider on the right lunged his bike forward to catch it. That split second of greed was all the opening I needed. I didn't run away. I ran toward the pallet jack, leaning against the wall. I kicked the release valve, sending a heavy crate of industrial salt crashing into the path of the lead motorcycle. The bike skidded, the tires screaming as they lost grip on the wet cobblestones. The rider went down in a tangle of metal and sparks, the drive skittering across the ground into the darkness of a storm drain. "No," the second rider roared, his voice distorted by his helmet. He abandoned his weapon, diving off his bike to reach for the drain. I didn't wait to see if he found it. I grabbed Sophia as she reached the street, a white and blue police cruiser skidding to a halt in front of us. This time, the officers who stepped out didn't look like they were on anyone's payroll. They looked young, terrified, and overwhelmed by the chaos of the night. "Get us out of here!" I screamed, shoving Sophia into the back seat. I looked back into the alley. The fallen rider was struggling to stand, but the other one was staring at me, his visor up for the first time. It was the neighbor from my building, the one Leo had introduced as a friend. He wasn't a mercenary, he was the corporate handler. "You've just signed your son's death warrant, Emily," he spat, his face a mask of corporate fury. The police car roared to life, the tires smoking as we sped away toward the hospital. My heart was a drum, but my mind was a cold, calculating machine. They thought the drive was the prize. They didn't realize that the tracker I'd found on Toby's blanket wasn't just a recording device. I had reversed the signal while I was in the ambulance. I pulled out my phone, watching a small blue dot move across the map of Lisbon. It wasn't the SUV following us. It was a signal coming from a private medical transport leaving the city. "They didn't just take Arthur," I whispered, the realization chilling my blood. "They have Leo, and Leo has the physical copies of the patents." The climax of the night was shifting. It wasn't about the land anymore. It was about the man who had sold us out and the fact that he was currently being extracted by the very people he thought were his partners. The police cruiser's interior felt like a cage of blue and red strobe lights as we tore through the historic district. Beside me, Sophia was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at the upholstery. She had spent her life as a puppet, and now that the strings were cut, she was falling apart. But I didn't have the luxury of a breakdown. I stared at the blinking blue dot on my phone screen. The private medical transport, the ambulance Leo was supposedly being processed in, wasn't heading for the central infirmary. It was moving toward the private docks of the Tagus River. "They're taking him to a boat," I whispered, the cold clarity of a researcher finally seeing the full data set. "They're not extracting him, they're disposing of him." Leo was a loose end. He had the patents, yes, but once they were uploaded to the Geneva server via the encrypted link he thought was his escape hatch, he became a liability, a husband who could testify, a son who knew too much about his father's shadow dealings. The corporate investors didn't want a partner, they wanted a ghost. "Officer, change direction," I commanded, leaning forward to the front seat. "The Doca de Alcantara. Now." "Senora, I have orders to take you to the hospital," the young officer began, his voice wavering. "Your orders were written by a ministry that is currently under federal investigation." I snapped, the authority in my voice cracking like a whip. "If you want to be on the right side of history when the sun comes up, you'll follow that signal. My husband is in that ambulance, and he is the only physical link to the people who just bombed your precinct." The officer's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror. He saw the fire of a woman who had lost everything but her resolve. He slammed the steering wheel to the right, the tires screaming as he pulled a U-turn across 3 lanes of traffic. Sophia let out a muffled sob, but I ignored her. I was watching the blue dot. It had stopped. We reached the docks 5 minutes later. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and salt. The private medical transport was parked near a sleek black motor yacht that looked more like a stealth vessel than a pleasure craft. 2 men in dark suits were hauling a gurney toward the gangplank. On the gurney was a man wrapped in a sterile white sheet, his face pale and unrecognizable under the harsh floodlights of the pier. It was Leo. He looked sedated, his eyes half open and glassy, staring at the Lisbon sky he had tried so hard to flee. "Stop!" I screamed, throwing the cruiser door open before the car had even fully halted. I bolted toward the yacht, the wind whipping my hair across my face. The men in suits didn't reach for guns. They reached for the gurney, trying to shove it onto the deck. "Police! Freeze!" The officer shouted behind me, his weapon finally drawn. The men stopped. One of them looked at the cruiser, then at me, then at the unconscious man on the gurney. A cold, cynical smile touched his lips. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had already won. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote, similar to the one I had used to trigger the alarm in my apartment. "You're too late, Emily," he called out, his voice carrying over the lapping water. "The upload reached 100% 2 minutes ago. The patents are ours. The lithium rights are ours. And your husband. He's just a man with a very unfortunate history of clinical depression and a lethal dose of sedatives in his system." He kicked the brake of the gurney, sending it rolling toward the edge of the pier. "Leo!" I lunged, my fingers grazing the cold metal of the railing. The gurney tipped, the wheels spinning over empty air. For a split second, time seemed to dilate, the white sheet fluttering like a shroud, the dark water of the Tagus waiting like an open grave, and the man who had betrayed me looking up with a final flickering moment of recognition in his eyes. I grabbed the edge of the sheet, the fabric searing my palms as the weight of the man and the metal pulled me toward the edge. I was staring down into the black abyss, the yacht's engines beginning to roar, and the realization hitting me. I could let go. I could let the betrayal sink to the bottom of the river and walk away clean. But then I saw the small silver locket tangled in the folds of his hospital gown, the one that held Toby's first photograph. The gurney groaned, the metal screeching against the pier's edge as gravity fought to claim its prize. My muscles screamed, my heels sliding on the slick, oil-stained concrete. In that frozen heartbeat, I looked down at Leo. He wasn't the man who had stood at the altar with me. He was a hollowed-out shell, a pawn who had finally realized he was being sacrificed by the kings he worshipped. "Help me!" I shrieked at the young officer, who was torn between covering the fleeing men and saving a traitor. With a grunt of effort, the officer holstered his weapon and lunged, grabbing the back of my coat and the gurney's frame. Together, we heaved. The metal wheels slammed back onto the solid ground with a bone-jarring thud. Leo rolled onto the concrete, gasping, his eyes fluttering as the sedative's grip fought his adrenaline. On the yacht, the man in the suit didn't wait. He signaled the captain, and the black vessel roared, the wake nearly swamping the pier as it tore away into the darkness of the Tagus. They had the data. They had the patents. They were leaving the human wreckage behind because, in their world, people were just overhead. "Emily," Leo's voice was a wet, broken rasp. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers clutching at the hem of my black dress. I thought they'd let us go. They said, if I gave them the encryption, Toby would be safe. Don't you dare use our son's name to justify your greed. I spat, pulling my dress from his grasp. I stood over him, the harbor lights casting my shadow long and jagged across his prone body. You didn't do this for Toby. You did this because you were drowning in debts you were too proud to admit to, and you thought you could sell my life to buy your way out. Sophia crawled out of the police car, her knees hitting the pavement. She looked at her brother, then at the disappearing yacht, and finally at me. It's gone, isn't it? The money, the land, everything. The land is still there, Sophia, I said, my voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. I pulled the secondary remote from my pocket, the one I'd used to trigger the logic bomb in the alleyway. But they forgot one thing about the patents. I didn't just design the enzyme for extraction. I designed a secondary chemical marker for environmental tracing. It's like a digital dye. The moment they use that process on the Alentejo soil, every satellite in the EU will flag the runoff as a toxic violation. I looked at the black horizon where the yacht had vanished. They didn't steal a fortune, they stole a federal crime. Leo started to cough, a deep hacking sound that sprayed blood onto the white sheet. The lethal dose the man had mentioned wasn't a lie. The sedative was laced with something that was slowly paralyzing his respiratory system. The officers scrambled for his radio, calling for a second ambulance, but I just watched him. "Emily, please," Leo whispered, his face turning a sickly mottled blue. The antidote, in the bag, under the seat. I looked back at the medical transport. There was a black leather bag sitting on the driver's seat. I could save him. I could reach for the medicine and keep the father of my child alive. But as I stood there, the sound of Toby's muffled cries from the nanny cam footage echoed in my mind. I thought about the bruises they had planned for an innocent boy. I walked toward the ambulance, my heart a cold, ticking clock. I reached into the bag, my fingers finding the auto-injector. I walked back to Leo, kneeling beside him as his breathing became a series of shallow, desperate hitches. "You want to live, Leo?" I whispered in his ear, the salt spray of the river stinging my eyes. "Then you're going to give me the one thing the digital files couldn't. You're going to tell me where Arthur is meeting the buyers in Dubai, and you're going to say it on the record." I held the injector an inch from his thigh. His eyes went wide, reflecting the absolute clinical ruthlessness of the woman he thought he knew. He realized then that the peacekeeper was dead. "The Burj Al Arab," he wheezed, his lungs burning. "Suite 702, at dawn." I jammed the needle into his leg. As the life-saving fluid hissed into his veins, I stood up and turned to the detective, who had just arrived in a cloud of dust and sirens. "He's all yours," I said. "He's a witness, a suspect, and a traitor. Make sure he lives long enough to see his father fall." But as I walked away, my phone vibrated one last time. It was a video call from an unknown number. I swiped to answer. The screen showed a private jet cabin. Arthur was sitting there, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking perfectly composed. But he wasn't alone. Sitting across from him, strapped into a car seat I recognized from my own living room, was Toby. The roar of the yacht's engines was still echoing in the harbor, but the world had suddenly gone silent, replaced by the rhythmic hum of the jet cabin on my screen. My vision blurred as I stared at Toby. He was asleep, his head tilted to the side, his small chest rising and falling in the soft, ambient lighting of the plane. Arthur didn't look at the camera immediately. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the ice cubes clink with a terrifying, grandfatherly serenity. "You really are a brilliant strategist, Emily," Arthur said, his voice coming through the speaker with crystal-clear clarity. He finally looked up, his eyes devoid of the rage Beatrice had shown. Instead, there was only a cold, professional respect. The tax liens, the metadata bomb, even saving Leo, it was all quite impressive. You fight like a Carter. It's a pity you weren't born one. "Arthur," I choked out, my voice a jagged glass shard. I was standing on the edge of the pier, the wind whipping my hair, the police officers frozen behind me as they realized the stakes had just bypassed every law they represented. "If you touch him, if you even wake him up." "I'm not a monster, Emily. I'm a businessman," he interrupted, his tone as smooth as the silk tie he wore. "The hospital transport you saw was the decoy. My people picked Toby up from the ER wing 20 minutes before your detective even arrived. The officers you trusted, they were more expensive than the ones you didn't, but they were worth every cent." I felt the ground tilt. The breach at the station, the chase in the alley, the gurney on the pier, it had all been a masterclass in misdirection. While I was playing hero, saving a husband who had sold me out, Arthur had been executing the only move that mattered. He didn't need the patents anymore. He had the ultimate leverage. "What do you want?" I asked, the clinical coldness of my mind finally snapping into place. I wasn't a mother in that moment. I was a negotiator. The logic bomb, the environmental markers, I can disable them. "I want the dead man's switch you have tucked away in your lab's cloud server," Arthur said, leaning forward. The mask of the grieving patriarch was gone, replaced by the predator who had built the Carter Empire on the bones of his rivals. "I know you, Emily. You didn't just put a virus on that drive. You have a secondary file set to release to the European Securities and Markets Authority at 6 a.m. You're going to delete it. Now, in front of me." I looked at my watch, 5:12 a.m. The sunrise was beginning to bleed over the Lisbon skyline, a bruised purple light reflecting off the water. If I deleted that file, the lithium deal would go through unchallenged. The bribes would stay hidden, the environmental devastation would begin, and the people who had tried to ruin my life would walk away with billions. If I didn't, Toby would be in Dubai by breakfast, a guest of a man who had already proven that family was just another asset to be liquidated. "I need to see him," I whispered. "I need to know he's okay." Arthur reached out and gently stroked Toby's hair. The sight made me want to scream, a primal, visceral sound that stayed trapped in my throat. "He's fine. He'll be home for lunch, Emily, provided you fulfill your end of the bargain. I've sent a secure link to your phone. One click and the file is gone. The Carter name stays clean. You get your son, and we never ever speak again." I looked at the link on my screen. Behind me, Leo was being lifted into an ambulance, his eyes fixed on me with a desperate, pathetic hope. Sophia was sobbing at the detective's feet. They were the casualties of a war they hadn't even understood. I looked at the delete button. My finger hovered over the glass. I thought about the months of research, the years of gaslighting, and the blood Miguel had spilled in that hallway. But then I looked at Toby's sleeping face. I pressed the button. "Confirmation received," Arthur said, a thin, triumphant smile touching his lips. He raised his glass to the camera. "You made the right choice, Emily. A mother's love is a powerful variable, always predictable." The screen went black. The call ended. I stood in the silence of the docks, the first rays of the sun hitting the water, feeling the weight of the ultimate defeat. I had saved my son, but I had let the devil fly away with the world. But as I turned to the detective, my hand trembling as I handed him my phone, I whispered, "Did you get the tail number?" The detective nodded, his face grim. "We tracked the IP of the video call. It wasn't a private jet over the Atlantic, Emily. The background noise, the frequency of the engine. He's not in the air," I finished, a new, lethal fire igniting in my chest. "He's still on the ground. He never left the private hangar at Tyres Airport." Arthur had played his last card, but he'd made one mistake. He assumed a scientist doesn't know how to fake a digital background. The jet was a stationary prop, and the 6 a.m. file, I hadn't deleted it. I had just moved it to a different server, one that Arthur's secure link didn't have the permissions to reach. "Let's go," I said, stepping into the detective's car. "We have 40 minutes before he realizes he's been played." The tires of the detective's sedan shrieked against the asphalt of the A5 highway, a blurred landscape of salt-crusted suburbs and sleeping villas tearing past us at 160 kilometers per hour. My heart was no longer a frantic drum. It was a cold, precision-engineered metronome, counting down the seconds until the 6 a.m. deadline. Arthur thought he had broken me. He thought he'd traded a son for a secret. But he had made the fatal error of treating me like an emotional variable when I had always been the constant. "The Tyres Airport perimeter is locked down by the ministry's private security," the detective said, his radio crackling with frantic, low-level chatter from the few units he still trusted. If we roll up to the main gate, they'll have Toby in the air before we clear the first barrier. We need a different way in. I know the layout, I said, my eyes fixed on the digital blueprint of the hangar I'd pulled up on my phone. My lab did the environmental impact study for their fuel storage 3 years ago. There's a service crawl space that runs directly under Hangar 4. It's tight, it's filthy, and it's exactly where the thermal sensors are the weakest. We reached the outskirts of the airfield just as the horizon turned a bruised electric orange. The silhouette of Arthur's Gulfstream sat on the tarmac like a tethered predator, its engines whining with a low-frequency hum that signaled an imminent departure. I didn't wait for the car to fully stop. I rolled out, the gravel tearing at my palms, and sprinted toward the perimeter fence. Sophia was in the back seat, staring at me with a mix of awe and terror. The sister-in-law who had tried to steal my life was now the only witness to how I was taking it back. I slid into the service duct, the smell of jet fuel and stagnant water nearly choking me. I crawled on my belly through the darkness, the metal scraping my shoulders, my fingers searching for the junction box I knew was there. This was the second major climax, the moment where the peaceful wife became the saboteur. I found the override cable, the one that controlled the hangar's fire suppression system. If I triggered it, the hangar would be flooded with high-expansion foam, grounding every flight and shorting out the electronic locks. But it would also alert every guard on the tarmac. I had 30 seconds to reach the cabin door before the chaos became a cage. I pulled the lever. A muffled roar echoed through the duct as the overhead pipes in Hangar 4 exploded with a wall of white chemical foam. The alarms began to shriek, a piercing, dissonant wail that drowned out the jet engines. I burst out of the floor hatch, blinded by the white spray, and lunged toward the stairs of the Gulfstream. The cabin door was half closed. I slammed my weight against it, the metal bruising my shoulder, and tumbled into the plush leather interior. The private jet was exactly as I'd seen on the screen, a stationary set designed to look like a flight in progress. Arthur was standing by the bar, his scotch glass shattered on the floor, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "Emily?" he barked, reaching for a weapon inside his jacket. "I'm supposed to be at the docks, crying over my broken marriage," I finished, my voice a lethal, low-frequency hum. I didn't look at him. I looked at the car seat in the corner. Toby was awake. He was staring at the flashing red emergency lights, his eyes wide but silent. I lunged for him, my arms wrapping around the plastic shell of the seat, pulling him toward me with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "The file is still live, Arthur," I said, backing toward the door as the white foam began to seep into the cabin. "It hits every major news outlet and the ESMA at the top of the hour. You didn't delete the truth, you just confirmed that you were willing to kidnap your own grandson to hide it." Arthur's face went from shock to a cold, jagged rage. He stepped toward me, the gun finally clearing his holster. "You think you can leave this hangar? You think the people I work for will let you walk away with that data?" "They aren't your people anymore, Arthur," I said, gesturing to the window. Outside the black SUV, the handlers from the night were already being surrounded by the detectives' reinforced units. The investors didn't like failure, and Arthur had just led a trail of white foam and police sirens directly to their secret extraction point. He was no longer an asset, he was a liability. As I backed down the stairs, Toby clutched in my arms. I saw the lead handler, the neighbor from my building, slowly raise his own weapon. But he wasn't aiming at me. He was aiming at the man standing in the doorway of the jet. The last thing I saw before the detective pulled me behind the safety of an armored door was Arthur Carter's face, realizing that in the world of corporate shadows, there is no such thing as family loyalty. There is only the bottom line. A muffled pop echoed through the hangar. Then silence. I slumped against the cold metal of the police van, Toby's heart beating against mine, the white foam of the fire system making the world look like a winter graveyard. I was covered in grease, blood, and chemical dust, but for the first time in years, I could breathe. But as the detective approached me, his face pale and his hands empty, he didn't offer a congratulation. He handed me a satellite phone that was already ringing. "It's the Geneva office," he whispered. "They say they have something of yours that Arthur didn't even know about." The satellite phone felt like an ice cube against my ear, vibrating with a cold, digital persistence. The hangar was a chaotic tableau of white chemical foam and flashing blue lights, with Arthur's body being slumped into a black bag, and the neighbor being forced into a different kind of transport. I clutched Toby against my chest, his small hand gripping the fabric of my torn dress as I pressed the accept button. "Dr. Carter," a voice said, not the frantic scream of Beatrice or the desperate rasp of Leo. It was a woman's voice, cultured, neutral, and terrifyingly calm. "Congratulations on surviving the night. Arthur was always a sentimentalist. He believed legacy was about blood. We know better. Legacy is about data." "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I looked at the detective, who was signaling his men to sweep the rest of the facility. He didn't know I was on a different battlefield now, not, "We are the people who funded your husband's debts," she replied. "The ones who saw the potential in your enzyme research long before the Carters realized they could use it to leach lithium. We have the patents you uploaded to the Geneva server. Your logic bomb was clever, but we have some of the best cryptographers in the world. It didn't wipe the files, it just isolated them. We own your life's work now, Emily." I felt a hollow chill. The win in the hangar felt suddenly fragile. "If you have the patents, then leave us alone. Arthur is dead. Leo is in custody. The Carter name is a corpse. What else could you possibly want?" "The patents are the recipe, Dr. Carter. But you are the chef," she said, and I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. "And it seems Arthur wasn't the only one who kept secrets. We've been reviewing the medical records from the hospital wing where your son was held. The blood work the nurses did, the results were fascinating." My heart stopped. The biotech research I had been doing wasn't just about lithium, it was about genetic stabilizers. I had used my own experimental protocols to treat Toby's rare respiratory condition when he was an infant, a treatment that was technically off-book and highly illegal in the EU. "You have a very gifted son, Emily," the voice continued. "His blood contains the only stable version of the synthetic enzyme. The patents we stole are useless without the biological key that is currently sitting in your arms. You didn't just create a breakthrough, you turned your son into the prototype." I looked down at Toby, his innocent eyes looking up at me. My scientific ambition and my maternal desperation had merged into a nightmare I hadn't seen coming. I had made him the most valuable asset in the world, and I had done it to save his life. "We are sending a car," the woman said. "It will be at the airport gates in 3 minutes. You will get in with the boy. You will come to Geneva and you will finish the work. If you don't, the files we have on your unauthorized human trials will be released to the medical board. You'll go to prison, and the state will take the boy. And we have many friends in the state foster system." The phone went dead. I stood in the middle of the hangar, the white foam swirling around my feet like a rising tide. The detective was walking toward me, a look of relief on his face, thinking the nightmare was over. He didn't see the black sedan pulling up to the perimeter fence. He didn't see the men in suits stepping out, not with guns, but with legal folders. I realized then that the in-laws were just the opening act. The real drama wasn't about family land or tax liens. It was about the ownership of a human life. "Emily? Is he okay?" the detective asked, reaching out to touch Toby's shoulder. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the gate. "He's fine, detective," I said, my voice hardening into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. But I need you to do me one last favor. I need you to call the American Embassy. Tell them a high-level biotech asset is seeking asylum. Asylum? From what? I looked at the black sedan, then at the sunrise. From the people who think my son is a patent. The car door opened. The lead man didn't move toward us. He just waited, checking his watch with the same professional indifference Arthur had shown. This was the final pivot. To save my son from the in-laws, I had destroyed a dynasty. Now, to save him from the world I had created, I had to become a ghost. The detective stared at me, his radio crackling with the mundane cleanup of a crime scene that had already been rendered obsolete. He looked at the black sedan at the gate, then back at my face, realizing that the victim he had spent the night rescuing was now a high-value target in a game that spanned continents. Asylum, he whispered, his voice hushed. Emily, if you go to the Americans, you'll never see Lisbon again. You'll be in a black site or a corporate witness program before the sun is fully up. I'm already a ghost, detective, I said, my voice as cold as the chemical foam at my feet. I adjusted Toby in my arms, his weight the only thing grounding me to the earth. The Carters tried to bury me. The Geneva group wants to patent me. There is no home to go back to. The men from the black sedan began to walk toward the hangar. They didn't run. They didn't draw weapons. They moved with the terrifying confidence of people who owned the air we were breathing. The lead man, a silver-haired executive in a coat that cost more than my annual research grant, raised a hand in a mock, friendly wave. He held a tablet, the digital leash they intended to snap onto my neck. "Dr. Carter," he called out, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal. "Let's not make this difficult. We have the transport ready. Your son needs a specialist, and we have the best in Switzerland. Don't let your pride do more damage than Arthur's greed." I turned to the detective. "The American Embassy. Tell them I have the Icarus protocol files. Tell them the stabilizing enzyme is viable. They'll move heaven and earth to keep Geneva from getting it." Icarus protocol? The detective's eyes widened. He wasn't just a cop. He knew enough to know that name represented a shift in global pharmaceutical power. "Emily, you're starting a war." "No," I said, stepping toward the perimeter fence, away from the men in the suits and toward a secondary service gate. "I'm ending one." I pulled a small encrypted flash drive from the hidden lining of Toby's car seat, the real drive, the one I had swapped while everyone was distracted by the logic bomb in the alley. It contained the raw genetic data of the stabilization process, the biological key they were so desperate for. I didn't give it to the detective. I smashed it against the concrete bollard, the plastic shattering and the silicon chip snapping under my heel. The executive stopped mid-stride. His face went from professional calm to a mask of absolute murderous fury. "What have you done?" he roared. "I've made the research proprietary," I shouted back, the wind of the airfield whipping my hair. "You want the key? It's not on a drive anymore. It's in my head. And if you want it, you'll have to negotiate with the only person who knows how to replicate it." I saw the men reach for their holsters, their legal facade crumbling the moment the profit margin vanished. But they were too late. A black Suburban with diplomatic plates screamed around the corner of the hangar, kicking up a cloud of dust and foam. It didn't stop for the gate. It tore through the chain-link fence, the metal screeching as it veered toward us. The back door slid open. Two men in tactical gear with U.S. Marshal on their vests stepped out, their rifles leveled at the Geneva team. "Step back," the lead marshal commanded. I didn't wait for an invitation. I lunged into the back of the SUV, pulling Toby into the armored interior. As the door slammed shut, I saw the Geneva executive standing in the middle of the foam, his hands trembling with rage, his billion-dollar empire turning into a heap of useless patents. We tore out of the airport, the sirens of the Portuguese police and the diplomatic escort merging into a single, chaotic roar. I sat in the dark, armored cabin, holding Toby so tight I could feel his heartbeat. For the first time since the funeral dinner, I allowed myself to cry. Not with grief, but with the cold, hard satisfaction of a woman who had burned every bridge to build a fortress. "You okay, Doc?" the marshal asked, handing me a bottle of water. "I will be," I said, wiping my eyes. I looked at the tablet on the seat next to me. It was a message from the Lisbon Central Station. Status critical. Status in custody. Arthur status deceased. The family was gone. The land was toxic. The secrets were mine. But as I looked at the GPS on the dashboard, I realized we weren't heading for the embassy. We were heading for a private military terminal. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice dropping into a low, defensive growl. The marshal didn't look back. "Orders changed, ma'am. Someone in Washington wants to see the sample personally." He looked at Toby. The cliffhanger wasn't the end of the chase. It was the realization that I hadn't escaped the cage. I had just traded a small, family-owned prison for a global one. The armored Suburban lurched onto the tarmac of a secluded military airstrip on the outskirts of Lisbon, the tires kicking up a spray of fine gray dust that coated the reinforced windows. Outside, the pre-dawn light had shifted into a bruised, metallic gray. A C-130 Hercules sat idling at the end of the runway, its massive turboprops creating a localized hurricane that shook the very frame of our vehicle. "Washington?" I whispered, my voice sounding hollow against the hum of the engine. I looked down at Toby. He was awake now, his large, dark eyes reflecting the flickering tactical lights inside the cabin. He wasn't crying. He was staring at the U.S. Marshal with a haunting quiet curiosity that made my stomach churn. He didn't know he was no longer a grandson, a son, or even a boy. To the men in this car, he was a sequence of stabilized proteins. "Change of plans, ma'am," the marshal repeated, his face a granite mask of duty. "The situation with the Geneva conglomerate has escalated. They have lobbyists in the State Department. If we take you to the embassy, the legal red tape will keep you trapped in Portugal for months. On U.S. soil, under Department of Defense protection, you're untouchable." "Untouchable or unfree?" I countered, my grip tightening on Toby's car seat. I had spent the last 12 hours dismantling the Carter dynasty, outmaneuvering a corporate shadow, and witnessing the death of the man I once loved. I hadn't survived all that to become a government asset. "I am a private citizen. My son is a minor. You have no legal right to transport us without—" "With all due respect, Dr. Carter," the marshal interrupted, finally turning to look me in the eye. "Look behind you." I glanced out the rear window. 3 black SUVs, the Geneva team, had breached the airport perimeter and were tearing across the runway, ignoring the frantic signals from the Portuguese air traffic control tower. They weren't hiding anymore. They were willing to cause an international incident on the tarmac of a NATO ally just to stop that C-130 from taking off. "They aren't going to sue you, Emily," the marshal said, his voice dropping into a low, urgent rasp. "They're going to erase you and harvest the kid. Now, get out of the vehicle and run for the ramp. Move." The back door slid open, and the roar of the C-130's engines hit me like a physical wall of heat and noise. I grabbed Toby, shielding his face with my jacket, and bolted across the concrete. Behind us, I heard the screech of tires and the sharp, rhythmic pop-pop-pop of suppressed gunfire. The Portuguese police units, caught between the Americans and the Geneva mercenaries, were falling back, outgunned and confused. I reached the metal ramp of the plane, my lungs burning, my heels clicking a frantic tempo against the steel. A hand reached out, not a soldier's, but a man in a lab coat, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. "Dr. Carter, quickly, we have the stabilization chamber ready for the transport." Stabilization chamber. They weren't just taking us to Washington. They were preparing to treat Toby like a biological sample from the moment we left the ground. I stopped at the edge of the ramp, the wind of the propellers nearly knocking me off my feet. I looked back at the carnage on the runway. The Geneva SUVs had been pinned down by a line of American snipers, but more vehicles were appearing at the horizon. "Emily, get on the plane," the detective shouted from the distance, his voice barely audible over the turbines. He was standing by his car, his badge glinting one last time before the dust obscured him. He was the only one who had truly tried to help, and now he was watching me disappear into a different kind of darkness. I stepped onto the ramp. The heavy hydraulic doors began to groan shut, sealing out the salt air of Lisbon and the wreckage of my old life. As the interior lights of the cargo hold flickered on, I saw a row of black trunks, all labeled with the Carter family crest, Arthur's files, Leo's research, everything they had seized from the estate while I was at the docks. The Americans hadn't just rescued me, they had scavenged the entire Carter empire. I sat on a cold webbing seat clutching Toby to my chest as the C-130 began its high-speed taxi. I looked at the man in the lab coat who was already reaching for a medical kit. "Don't touch him," I said, my voice a jagged edge of ice. "Dr. Carter, we need to verify the protein levels." I said, "Don't touch him." I pulled a small silver pen from my pocket, the one I'd taken from Leo's bag at the pier. It wasn't a pen. It was a concentrated vial of the destabilizing agent I developed in the lab. "If any of you come within 3 feet of my son, I'll drop this on the floor. We're in a pressurized cabin. We'll all be dead before we hit 10,000 feet. The cargo hold went silent. The soldiers and the scientists stared at me, realizing that the distraught mother was the most dangerous person on the flight. "We're going to Washington," I said, my voice steady as the plane tilted upward, the G-force pressing me into the seat. "But we're doing it on my terms. You want the Icarus Protocol? You're going to have to negotiate with the woman who holds the trigger." The plane leveled out, the vast, dark Atlantic stretching out beneath us. I looked at Toby, who had finally fallen asleep again. I had won. I had beaten the in-laws, the corporations, and the betrayals. But as I looked at the Icarus label on the crate in front of me, I realized the final climax was still to come. Because on the manifest taped to the crate, there was one name I hadn't expected to see. Recipient Arthur Carter, deceased. Authorized proxy, Beatrice Carter. My heart stopped. Beatrice wasn't in a cell in Alentejo. She had been the authorized proxy for the Americans all along. The vibration of the C-130's floorboards hummed through my bones, a low-frequency reminder that I was suspended 40,000 feet above the Atlantic, trapped in a flying tomb of secrets. I stared at the manifest on the crate. Beatrice Carter. The name burned like a brand. I had watched her get handcuffed. I had seen her power crumble in that dining hall, or so I thought. In the cold, calculating world of high-stakes biotech, custody was just a temporary holding cell for a useful asset. The man in the lab coat, the one who had tried to approach Toby, backed away as I held the silver vial of the destabilizing agent. He looked toward the front of the cargo hold, where a thick steel door separated us from the flight deck. The door slid open with a sharp pneumatic hiss. Out stepped Beatrice. She wasn't wearing the torn black silk from the funeral or the heavy pearls of a matriarch. She was wearing a crisp, clinical white suit that made her look like an angel of death. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her expression as smooth as the Mediterranean. She didn't look like a woman whose husband had been shot or whose son was in a coma. She looked like a woman who had just closed the deal of a century. "You always were too smart for your own good, Emily," Beatrice said, her voice easily cutting through the roar of the engines. She didn't look at me. She looked at the car seat where Toby lay sleeping. "You thought the Americans were your rescue? They were my buyers. Arthur was too messy, too focused on the lithium dirt. He didn't see that the real money was in the stabilization process you perfected for the boy." "You sold your own grandson to the Department of Defense?" I whispered, my hand trembling as I gripped the vial. "You planned the kidnapping? The breach at the station? All of it?" "I facilitated a transfer of assets," she corrected, walking slowly toward me, her heels clicking on the metal floor. "The Geneva group was too volatile. The Americans offer stability, and in exchange, I get to keep the Carter name clean, the estate restored, and a very comfortable seat on the board of the new Icarus initiative. The betrayal was total. It was a circle that had closed around me the moment I married into this family. Leo's debts, the tax liens, the hostile in-laws, it had all been a pressure cooker designed to force me to finalize the research. They had needed a crisis to make me desperate enough to test the enzyme on Toby. "I won't let you have him," I said, standing up, my back against the vibrating hull of the plane. "I'll drop this vial, I'll vent this cabin, we'll all go down into the Atlantic." Beatrice stopped 3 feet away. She smiled, a thin, predatory curve of the lips. "No, you won't, Emily. Because you're a scientist. You know that if this plane goes down, the stabilization process dies with you. And without the monthly boosters only this lab can provide, Toby will be dead within 6 months. You didn't just save him, my dear. You made him a permanent resident of our world." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The Icarus Protocol wasn't a cure. It was a dependency. By saving my son's life with my research, I had tied his heartbeat to the very people I hated most. I looked at Toby, his innocent face oblivious to the fact that he was now the biological property of a global superpower. But as Beatrice reached out to take the car seat, I looked at the dead man's switch alert on my phone. 6 a.m. The file had just been released. "You forgot one thing, Beatrice," I said, a cold, jagged laugh escaping my throat. "I didn't just send the research to the news. I sent the proof of your involvement. The recordings of you and Sophia, the wire transfers to the ministry, and the GPS coordinates of this very plane to the International Criminal Court and the European Aviation Authority." Outside the small porthole, the dark Atlantic sky was suddenly illuminated by 2 streaks of light, fighter jets. Portuguese F-16s flanked by an EU interceptor. "This isn't a rescue flight anymore," I said, as the plane suddenly banked hard to the left, the alarm bells on the flight deck beginning to scream. "It's an international incident. You might own the patents and you might own the Americans, but you don't own the airspace. We're being forced down in the Azores." Beatrice's mask finally cracked. Her eyes darted to the window, the fear finally replacing the arrogance. The C-130 groaned as the pilots struggled to respond to the interceptors. The soldiers in the hold scrambled for their headsets, the stability of the deal evaporating in real time. I grabbed Toby, strapped him into the car seat, and moved toward the emergency parachute stowage. I didn't need a patent, and I didn't need a family name. I had the truth, and I had the only thing that mattered. "The Carter legacy ends here, Beatrice," I shouted over the deafening roar of the depressurizing cabin. As the ramp began to lower for an emergency landing, I looked at the horizon. The sun was finally rising over the Atlantic, a blinding, golden light that washed away the shadows of the night. The people who had weaponized family status had lost their leverage all at once. The reversal was concrete, public, and irreversible. I stepped toward the opening, the wind howling around us, ready to face a world where I didn't need anyone's permission ever again.